Anthropological Oxymorons. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, a doctoral student in psychology, and with me today is Mr. Norman Gayford, a professor of English and philosophy. The study of ontology boils down to asking the question, what is it like to be? This is a question that we revisit in various ways frequently throughout the show. But the first difficulty with this question lies in our subjective experience. All we know is our being. And if we're honest, we are too integrated into that paradigm to even reflect on it properly. The second difficulty arises from categorical overlap. When we ask, what is it like to be, are we really asking an ontological or an epistemological question? After all, instead of asking what it's like to be, we could just as easily ask, how do we know what it's like to be? If you're still with me and are wondering why it's pertinent, then I would ask you, what is it like to be sentient?
That's a really fine start after we've been away for a little bit of that.
Yeah, so Sentience, you and I were, we've done some research over the past week, and we were talking about it a little bit before the show. It's going to be, I think this one's going to be really fun, and it's going to be challenging, to say the least. So, what is sentience?
Okay, so we were talking about this downstairs before we started, weren't we? That sentience is not the same as some other concepts that it's often conflated with. So sometimes sentience is conflated with consciousness. But we talked about consciousness, and probably always will, and that's a much more complicated, seemingly, thing. Sentience seems less complicated, but I think it probably has the same degree of complexity, but it's not the same thing. So if we lower the bar, so to speak, sentience in philosophical terms refers to things called qualia. Qualia are feeling. Feeling pleasure, feeling pain, feeling hurt, feeling the senses. So sentient or sentience is more about whether or not we are aware of things that affect us, at the very least physically. Then we can get into all the other stuff.
Yeah, and I think that probably a lot of listeners hear that description and they go, oh wow, that's a lot more basic than what I thought it would mean. And I think that's because linguistically, like you were saying, sentience is conflated with consciousness, and probably even throughout the numerous episodes we've done, we've sort of used it that way.
Sentio as a prefix, sentio as a root means to feel.
Right.
That's it.
It's pretty basic. And it even seems pretty cut and dry, right? But as we've found out with philosophy over 102 episodes, the more basic or the more cut and dry something seems, usually the less so it actually is. And as I said in the intro, a lot of times those difficulties stem from either categorical overlaps. So when you boil something down to such a point, you come to fundamental questions about, well, where's this stemming from? How are we saying that we know what this fundamental or foundational concept means?
Yeah.
And then, the other primary difficulty is language, itself.
It is very much language. There's an old, 1960s theory called the Sapir-Whorf theory, not Worf from Star Trek, way before that, and in linguistics. And it's the idea that's very strong in linguistic field, that our language shapes our perceptions. And we've gone in and out about language since we've started. And I think it very much is part of this. So feeling is not perception in the language of sentience. But I also think we have this popular culture and popularization of science that sometimes unintentionally misleads. So we'll have a Star Trek episode or heaven knows what, and some science officer or other will say, well, we're seeking sentient life forms. Well, that means you're just finding things that feel.
Right.
They don't necessarily think. They don't.
Yeah.
And you don't really expect that. You think, oh, we're talking about intelligence. No.
Yeah. Exactly. So, yeah, and this is, man, this is going to be some really interesting stuff, but I don't want to jump ahead. Yeah. So, looking at the formative part of it, how did the concept of sentience arise in philosophy?
I think it goes right back to the old ones, to sound Lovecraftian. When you have Aristotle saying things about animals, and talking about man as animal, man as a goal-seeking animal. His life only has meaning if he is reaching out and striving for his goals. But he also says things about basic things about what animals do, how they hunt, how we separate animals from justice. So it's more about animals, but the idea of sentience emerges when Aristotle's talking about these kind of things, when to the size of the state there is a limit, as there is to plants, animals, and implements, for none of these retain their facility when they are too large. So he talks about the state, he talks about individuals, he talks about them in animal terms. Basically, it goes back to movement and motion, which the pre-Socratics were talking about. So if the universe is not static, the universe is in motion. If things are in motion, things bump into each other. And then the question comes, do they hurt when they bump each other? It's not exactly how it was formed, but that's really what's going on.
Yeah, I think that is important. I think that the conversation about sentience in philosophy, I think that it's probably accurate to say it goes back to when the first philosopher recognized that man is an animal, right? Not that man is some separate thing, but that when you realize man's an animal, right? That I think that recognition in itself sort of removes that top level of consciousness or meta cognition that does separate us from animals, as far as we know.
As far as we know. And then we always have to say that.
And that's an important part that we'll get, because that, like I said in the intro, that's where the ontological versus epistemological part of it comes in, that we'll talk about in the speculative portion.
And I'm going to add one more thing.
Yeah.
And that is that when you're asking for, as we usually do, the formatives, all right, 1600s, philosophers, and I don't remember which philosopher, but in the 1600s, take the term, an ability to feel. They find the term, a Latin term, sentientem, a feeling, to distinguish it from reason. So it didn't come into coinage until about 500 years ago.
Yeah, and during a very critical time in philosophy, because that was sort of at the height of this turn from classical Greek rationalism into sort of the Enlightenment philosophy. So that separation between reason and feeling, that's
was breaking down a little bit, or was being crossed over.
Right. Yeah. And this is something that's still happening today, like we talked about in episode 100, right? I think it was episode 100. It might have been something before that, but we were talking about Platonic idealism and things, and then how Kant and Hume and these guys, it's like, well, were they talking about the same philosophical concepts as these guys, but just in was it just a renewal?
Yeah.
No, there was something different about it. This is still happening today. In the field of psychology that I'm studying, right?
You must encounter it all the time.
Yeah, there's something going on in psychology now where it's it's modernism versus postmodernism, right? And so modernism is science as everybody's familiar with it, right? Which is you start from a neutral position and then you gather data and you attempt to analyze it as objectively as you can, and the conclusions that you draw are scientific. Which is essentially rationalism, right? Postmodernism is this idea that, well, because psychology, it's humans studying human brains, you cannot start from a neutral position, right? You're always going to have implicit biases or values. And those implicit values or ideals necessarily affect the way that you research things or how you do stuff, or even the subjects that you're studying, their biases and things affect in such a point that there is no neutrality. The feeling part of it is always there, and it should be part of science. So this is a battle that's going on right now, right? And
it is.
And, there's certain scientists on either side of it. And, it's, in my opinion, watching it play out, right, I think that there's some value to postmodernism in a clinical setting, right? I think that it is important for a clinical psychologist to recognize their own biases, their own background, their own beliefs and values, and those of their client before they start utilizing scientific or theories or practices with that patient. But from a research standpoint, it becomes hard to say that these, that you should start from anywhere but a neutral place, even if it's not possible that you should try to do anything other than start from and end in a place of objectivity,
And objectivity and neutrality also are not entirely interchangeable. We started out by saying that consciousness and sentience are not, but there's a very strong relationship between the two. It's just sentience is sort of at the beginning. Well, objectivity is the attempt to see things outside of what might lead you to confirmation bias. Neutrality is more of a political kind of term, or has become so, where we'll all agree to just stay at this particular. We won't argue about this, that, or the other thing. And it is hard. I had the great joy of having a class this week. It really wasn't a class. It was just I was giving a workshop voluntarily, subversively to a group of grad students who wanted help with the APA citation format. And that was in my wheelhouse for a long time and still is. So we were talking, but one of the questions that they wondered was the classic question I always got in writing classes, which is, can I use the word I? And my response is, well, APA, science, social sciences, harder sciences are sort of going toward that in ways that they didn't 20, 30 years ago. But one always asks the question, but why do you want to use the word I? And, well, how do I say something that doesn't have the word I in it? All right, let's make it this. I feel pain when my hand is close to fire. All right. We feel pain when our hand is close to fire. That backs it away from I. More objective, humans feel pain when their hands are close to fire. If that's too much, proximity to fire creates pain. We say it all kinds of different ways, but we cannot eliminate, and we know it, the I. And that's what you were talking about.
Yeah, and this does have something to do with what we're talking about. I think that progression that you just presented is the progression from an ontological to an epistemological question, right? From what is it like to be to, well, how do we know what it's like to be? If we say proximity to fire causes pain, to what, right? Because there are some animals that proximity to fire might not cause them pain if you live in a thermal vent that's 200 degrees. Right? So all right. So getting back on track, right? I guess the next question would be, how have philosophers distinguished between sentience and consciousness and other aspects of the mind.
Go ahead.
We sort of set the tone here with looking at how sentience arose in philosophical discussion.
Mm-hmm.
So, how did they set about consciousness, right? Sentience, other ways that humans or other beings think. Where are they drawing that distinction?
Well, we start. Well, we have to start somewhere. So let's start with Descartes. Back to I think, therefore I am. Well, packed into all of that is, if you've got the mind-body duality, is the mind separate from the body? Is the mind feeling pain? That all emerges out of that. It's not necessarily what was intended, but I think it was when you read the material. It's not just mind and body. End of story. And I think that's, again, in the time period we were mentioning, that's where this question's really coming up. How does this meat machine function? They weren't calling it that back then. How does this organic construct function? Is there a ghost in the machine that makes it happen, and so on? So what's really feeling? Is it the nerve endings? If we fast forward to any number of current philosophers who talk about us being nothing but, and we've talked about this before, that we're just organic and that's it. And we have the impression of having a personality and a consciousness, but that's all generated by the organic need for the machine to continue. I've never found myself able to completely accept that. I understand the argument, but something's missing there. But in any case, so we go from the idea of duality to the attempt again to put everything into a mono term. And so we get to Thomas Nagel, and he's the one who asked the question about, as you know, what is it like to be a bat?
Yeah.
Right? It's one of his anchoring works. And out of all of that come investigations on what comes first, the feeling or the perception of a feeling. And that's where we go from sentience to consciousness. And I'm not trying to stray us all over the place, but I think somewhere in this scaffolding that we're doing, that leads to the idea of, if someone, for instance, is under anesthesia and the body is rendered immobile, but the anesthesia has to some extent worn off, so the person is immobile but still feels the surgery. Is there pain? Yes. And this has been documented. This has happened. Do outside observers register the pain? Not necessarily.
Yeah, and this is where the concept of sentience gets really difficult, because,
yes,
like you're saying, everything, all of classical philosophy was this rationalism trying to discover what the interaction between the mind and body was. And you had, all the way up from, Descartes to Kant to Hume to Spinoza,
yes,
people with skepticism, and it was basically this fight, right, between skepticism and mono views of things versus a dualistic and sort of esoteric kind of thing.
The esoteric part is is in part things like we can never understand the qualia. Yeah. We don't know what it's like for you to. I don't know what it's like for you to feel something because I'm not you. That's one of the positions that current philosophy takes.
And qualia. I mean, this is sort of the word around which this concept of sentience revolves, right? Because, all right, so we talk about qualia and sentience in terms of sensation or feeling, but where do you draw the line on what is qualia? Is it a sense of touch and sight or hearing? But then as we work our way up to thoughts, right?
Mhm.
Or you and I talking right now, right? So your voice hitting my ears is a sensation. But how my brain is using those random sounds to construct meaning out of them, is that qualia? Is that just a sensation? Is that just a feeling? Or is there something else going on? And that's where the line between sentience and consciousness is
Yes.
drawn.
Yes.
And I think that if we're just looking at it from a human paradigm, it seems pretty simple, right? Like, so we know, if we look at like uh, a, the word escapes me, but a cognitive processing psychological paradigm, right?
Mhm.
Basically, the first several milliseconds of my conscious experience is sensation. So, light hitting my eyes, sound waves hitting my ears.
Yes.
Then there's an integration period where my brain is swapping all the signals around, making sense of them. And then there's a short-term memory thing where I'm working with it, and there's a long-term memory thing where I'm encoding it, right? That's all fine and dandy, right? So there's a line. We know, okay, so sensation is that initial thing, and then
We know how it works.
right.
Sort of.
Where it gets difficult though is if you start, again, like I said in the intro, we only know our being, and this is what you're talking about as well.
Yes.
We only know what it's like to be humans. And so it's been pretty easy in the past being humans and looking at things from a human paradigm to examine the animal kingdom and say, okay, well, none of these things might be sentient, but none of these things are conscious because the processing isn't going on the way it is in a human mind. And that's the qualifier, the qualia, right? But the more we start to learn about these things, what's it like to be a bat? Or an article I sent you earlier in the week, what's it like, bees,
Bees, right?
octopus, whales. And the more we start to learn about these things and see the way that they process information and the actions that they take off of it, that's when drawing the line between sentience and consciousness suddenly gets very fuzzy.
Yes, or slicky or oily or whatever, depending on the creature. It does, and it's fascinating because even when we think we know, I'm listening to you describe the process well, and you're bringing up all the points and the questions therefrom, I still don't know what it's like. Let's think about what we have been coming to know about the wide range. Everyone likes to use the phrase "on the spectrum" now. Okay, well, if there is a spectrum for humanity and for qualia, then we're all on the spectrum somewhere, or our process of bringing them in is. But there are people for whom this level of volume would hurt their ears. Or there are people for, if the light is too bright, it would shatter or dominate their consciousness. And there was a time when people would seem to always, people try to take the simple route and to say, well, you're not normal. Or normal people can handle bright light. What's wrong with you? Or, just get used to it because that's what you have to do. And not helpful things, right? But when we realize, we have the capacity to realize that light can hurt some people, just as one example. This is why I take issue with, and I don't begin to understand everything that Daniel Dennett writes, and he's a brilliant writer, and I find him fascinating to read. But he essentially says we should just toss qualia out the window because they're really meaningless. And I can never operate under the notion that our perception of what it feels like to be something, that this is the basis of poetry. This is the basis of so much art. I think if we throw that out, we throw out some of our humanity. And I think Dennett is trying to tell us that humanity is about being the machine.
Yeah. And so this is getting at this idea of what are the minimum qualifications for sentience, right? And there's sort of two paradigms. There's phenomenal and effective consciousness. is what they, and again, here we go with the word consciousness and sentience being conflated. But, phenomenal consciousness is what I think what Dennett is talking about, which is just that initial simple definition that we gave at the beginning of the episode. Can you sense things? That's phenomenal consciousness or sentience, right? Effective consciousness or sentience goes a bit beyond that, right? So what are the minimum qualifications needed for sentience that have been kind of established through
philosophy and science, where they sort of intersect, is you have to have some kind of neural framework, neural structure. Even if it's not a central nervous system that we amazing anthropomorphs, humans have, we sapiens, how grand we are. But we all have anything that is going to be sentient will have a neural structure, because otherwise the qualia couldn't take place.
Right.
So that's really the basic.
And so again, just like with qualia, this idea of feeling gets kind of complicated. Or central nervous system, right?
Yes.
So I know that when we talk about central nervous systems, we're appealing to a scientific or empirical idea of neurons and dendrites and glial cells and these sorts of things. But let me give you an example, right? So there is a type of snail that uses 2 neurons. That's all it uses, and it just determines if it's hungry or if it's not. And so one, and on this little light bright, there's just 2 lights. One light lights up, it starts eating stuff. The other light, it goes out, it doesn't eat stuff, right?
Yeah.
Let's contrast that with this white fungus, right? That lives in forests, and it connects trees underground and other types of fungus and other types of plants, and it essentially ferries nutrients throughout the forest. It acts as a chemical messenger.
I was just about to say chemical messenger. Yeah.
And so, and what they found is that this is very sophisticated, and that the trees themselves will communicate through this fungus. They'll share nutrients. So if a tree is struggling, it might ask for nutrients from other trees in order to help it. If the tree knows it's beyond repair, it's going to die, it will give its nutrients back to other trees. Parent trees have been shown to have favoritism towards their trees that they have, are a family of theirs. Seems a lot more complex than, am I going to eat something or am I not going to eat something, right? So, is this a central nervous system? Well, not if you're thinking about dendrites and neurons and glial cells.
No.
But the processing that's happening, and again, feeling, right? This is sort of our key term here, feeling, right? Surely the snail with its 2 neurons knows what it's like to feel hunger and fullness. But apparently the snail does not know how to feel empathy towards its offspring, or if a community around it needs assistance, or if it's close to the end of its existence.
Yeah.
And so this becomes really complicated in saying, well, sentience is sensation and feeling. Well, but it's sensation and feeling with a central nervous system. That's a big qualifier.
That is a very big qualifier, and a neural structure is what we're talking about, with that very simple neural structure of the snail. But again, where this goes is giving more gravitas and complexity to the word feeling. And if we pare that away, and I'm not saying I want the gravitas for the word feeling, but if we pare it away, it feels hungry or it doesn't. That's That's the feel.
Hmm.
What does it feel like to be hungry? That's a lot harder to describe, even for something with a central nervous system.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, think about it. What do you say when I'm hungry? How do you know? My stomach's growling. Yes, and what else? I feel hangry. What does that mean? That means I'm feeling kind of itchy and growly because I don't have enough calories. So that's what it feels like not to have enough calories. Is there pain involved? Well, does it hurt to be hungry? Well, yes. If you're going, too many people on this planet know that. But when we just say I'm hungry, we all think we know what we mean.
But we don't. And that's what you were saying with qualia, right? Is that my idea of what it means to be hungry is going to be wildly different than somebody in a third world country, or what it means for me to be tired, or for it to be bright in here, for it to be loud in here. And they've demonstrated this, that people with red hair they feel pain more significantly than other people. So we know this, right? There's highly sensitive people. So just within the human race, within the human species, there's a wide variance in how qualia is perceived.
Yes.
And you get into other aspects, right? I have no sense of smell. There is no qualia for me with that sense. As a matter of fact, we were hanging out with some of our friends last weekend, and we were at a restaurant eating breakfast, and there's this red squeeze bottle on the table, right? So I squeeze some of this on my home fries, and I eat it. And I go, man, you guys have to try this sauce. It's amazing. And they're like, well, what is it? I'm like, I don't know. It's really sweet. I've never tasted anything like it. My other friend squeezed some on his plate, eats it. He goes, this is ketchup. And I go, no, it's not. This is different from ketchup. And they ask the server, and she goes, oh yeah, that's ketchup. Right. And so everybody has a good laugh at me, right? But that's the thing, is without a sense of smell, the individual components that make up ketchup, a lot of them disappear. And so even though I've had ketchup before, if the ingredients that go into, if this particular ketchup brand used more sugar than another type, that sugar overpowers any of the nuanced things, especially with no sense of smell. And suddenly it's this strange sugary substance that I can't identify because
you don't have
tomato,
that extra...
the salt, the salty, or the the other parts of what make it taste different have been overwhelmed by the taste buds without the olfactory input. And so that, obviously this is, smell is, if you're going to lose a sense, that's the one you want to lose
and because of COVID, I still have occasional, it's not nearly as in and out as it was close to the event, but there will be days when I can smell and days when I can't. And I never know, waking up, until how do you know that you can't smell? Well, you start trying to smell. What does that mean? You sniff and nothing comes in. But you see, we try to put words around this. As simple as that is, or you walk with somebody, or my granddaughter will say to me, Grandpa, can you smell today? Well, yes, I actually can. Then she'll stick a flower to my nose. But it's a flower that doesn't have a scent. But she says, that flower smells. Oh, that smells so good. And she's making it up, I think. But I don't know, because because she may have this acute awareness of some scent that I'm not getting. So I know that's a goofy little example, but I think it's actually pretty serious. We just make assumptions.
Yeah. There's the huge viral thing a few years ago about the dress that was, is it blue and black or is it white and gold, right? Two completely opposite colors, right? But the population was pretty much split on what color this dress was. And that, I think that shook a lot of people's worlds, right? To realize that, half the population could look at this thing and see something that was almost completely the opposite of what the other half was seeing. And that raises the question, what is the difference between a sensation and a feeling? We've talked about sentience as being the ability to sense and the ability to feel. Is there a difference between a sensation and a feeling?
Wow. in the nature of the words and what they imply, or what accrues to them, like barnacles on a ship, yes, a sensation is more scientifically viable as a term. I have a sensation of hot or cold, of sharp or dull. Okay. I feel something that is sharp or cold. But the word, if I feel this, I am putting an intermediary object in, whereas I sense, there may not be anything there, but I sense the touch or something, a breeze that moves across your skin.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the example of the snail and the fungus is a good example, right? Because it seems like sensation is to feeling as sentience is to consciousness in a way, where the snail has a feeling of hunger and a feeling of satiation that goes along with a sensation, most likely, of eating or of not eating. The fungus, it seems, has sensation. It can sense when a tree is sending it a signal that it needs nutrients or that another, to do something. But does the fungus have a feeling of what it's, of the need?
And thus far, we don't know.
And that's an interesting, it can sense need, but can it feel need?
Yeah.
And that, I think that's where the difference is that, and I think the interesting thing about feeling is what you just alluded to in your description, which is that feeling can be misleading, right? One of my favorite scientific experiments is when they cover a subject's arm with to hide it, and then they put a fake arm in front of them that you can't see where it's connected, and then they touch both hands with a feather in the same exact way, and they trick the brain into thinking that the fake arm is a real arm. And then you can stab it, and the subject will feel pain in their real arm. So they're not sensing pain because the real arm is not being affected, but they are feeling.
They are feeling it as a kind of an anticipatory. I've known some old guys, older much than I, who they want their nails trimmed or they want their eyebrows trimmed, and you go to trim the eyebrows and they'll say "ouch" before they right. Okay, so and you might say, "Come on, grow up" or whatever, but they're anticipating something. But we don't know. We have this anthropomorphic chip on our shoulder, so that we'll get all. I'm going to go into. I'm going to cross the spectrum really fast here. We'll get all high and mighty and moralistic when we talk about abortion. And people say, well, a fetus can feel. Look, it can respond at a certain point. All right, yes. But don't get all moralistic on me about that when we allow ourselves to not feel or to go ahead and kill other things with abandon. This is where it gets really philosophical, how I'm going to cross the spectrum. We kill things every day. By action or by inaction. Our very presence in the world kills things. Our very contribution to the environment kills things with the environment. We kill trees. We take weeds down. We smush insects and so on and so on, often when we don't need to. And so sentience, if we think of just sentience as the capacity for things to feel sensation, and we say, no, it's wrong to do something to a creature if it can have a sensation, but we do it all the time to feed ourselves because we say we can't feed ourselves other way. But even if we do it to plants, which can have sensation. And so we kill things all the time.
Yeah, we're fully into it now, and we've talked about this. It's been a while, so I think it's good. But this is something that has popped up in other episodes, and you've outlined it perfectly. Which is, so we've been setting the stage all episode for this conversation, right? Which is, like you said, if you, and if you start reading about sentience, you'll see that a lot of the philosophers do start making these moral statements, which are things like, and these are intellectuals, professional philosophers saying things like, if something has sensation or the ability to feel, then it deserves the right to live a life free of pain. But as we've seen, modern science is really starting to make it very difficult to live by that credo, because
yes, it is.
Like we talked about the fungus, same thing with that. If you start cutting down the tree, they found that the tree, quote unquote, screams. They can sense the pulsations through the fungus that the tree is sending out a distress signal. If that's not sensation or feeling,
then what is?
Right. And, same thing with plants. I had a particularly disturbed, one of my friends, he grew up on a farm, right? And he was talking about, harvesting animals. And he made just the offhanded comment, right, that, oh, pigs are the worst because pigs scream.
Mm-hmm.
That's horrifying. It's really, that made me, it made me think, oh man, I don't,
Yeah, do you want to? Oh, I don't want to think about that. I just want to eat my bacon. Okay, but.
And again, it's language, right?
Yes.
Using the word scream versus, a vocalization, right? When you think about the tree sends out a distress signal versus the pig screams, right? If you swapped those, right, the tree screams or the pig sends out a distress signal, the language plays a big part in how we view those events.
Back to Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, and back to what you said about neutrality and objectivity. And that takes us into euphemism. Oh, it's much better. It's much more distant and objective to say it sends out a distress signal. So do I when I stub my toe. It's not one I want anybody else to hear. Distress signal. But an old dear friend of mine, we were talking yesterday about this podcast I was going to do, and said, many creatures are sentient, just not to our knowledge and observation. She believes, and I concur. Sentience lies under non-human rights groups and others trying to establish through courts to the habeas corpus for standing for individual creatures, elephants, apes, and so on. Or in the I was listening to a panel discussion from the London School of Philosophy and Economics that happened this past June. And toward the end, they were fielding questions. And one of the questions was, do you think that laws need to be established for dealing with wild animals? And they said, absolutely, because our laws right now are for wild animals that are under domestic control in zoos and so on. But if you believe, well, it's out in the wild, so we can just kill it. Well, why? Because it's sportsmanlike. Okay, so it's the need to go out and kill, whether you need to go out and kill, is sportsmanlike. Well, I have a right to kill animals. What gives you that right? And then some people go to sacred text, and but it all comes back to nobody thinking about what it feels.
Yeah,
what does it feel like?
There's an interesting documented case of a Russian trophy hunter who went to hunt a tiger. His name escapes me. It's Vladimir something. I want to say it's Mozikov or something. Anyways, he goes to hunt a tiger. He finds a tiger. He shoots it and wounds it. The tiger escapes. Before he returns back to his hut, the tiger returns to his hut. The tiger tears apart everything that has his scent, then lies in wait, and when he returns, kills him. And the tiger waited, they know it was between 12 and 48 hours for him to return. That sure seems like sentient. I mean, if you look at it, right, you think about what the humans set out to do.
Yeah.
And then what the tigers set out to do, they don't seem all that different, do they?
No, they don't. I suppose that's why the movie recently, Beast, I didn't watch it. Idris Elba movie with a lion that seems to be stalking people. But it's a beast. So obviously it's the monster because humans have to, the anthropomorphic thing again. But we're back to it. Where the ethical philosophy comes in is, do we, well, first, the scientific, the basic philosophy is, does something have sensation? Can it feel pain, pleasure, hurt, whatever, extremes? And if it can, do we have any ethical responsibility toward that creature?
You want to know what makes that question very difficult for me? Is the time and developmental portion of it, right? You brought up abortion, right? Oh, look, the fetus can feel. Well, can the fetus feel or sense before a certain point?
Exactly.
Or with animals, or even, okay, let's say we know trees can feel, right? Oh, this tree can feel. But if I just go under the tree and harvest the nuts or the fruit that fall off of it and eat it, can those things feel? No, probably not. So there's that makes it difficult, right? So there's this idea of, well, what is the thing now versus the thing's potential, right? So when you're looking at an abortion argument or an argument for any of these different things, there's time, this mysterious thing that we all experience, we all live in, but can't quite put our finger on. There's a potential, right? There's a potential for this fetus to grow into a human. There's a potential for this nut to grow into a tree. How does that change the ethical or moral arguments that we make against,
That's marvelously said, because ultimately, if we say we have a right to make decisions about our bodies, something is within our bodies, that's the right that has been taken away in the country. And some people say yay, and a lot of people are saying nope, hands off. Nobody's saying this isn't a deep decision. Nobody's saying that this isn't a decision that has that the people. Some people are saying people just do this offhand and they just go ahead and do it. Nah, I've not encountered them. I volunteered for places. No, that's just a misleading thing. So that's. But even if we move away from that, your example is beautiful because it does encompass time and space and the potential of something. And so that takes us to something like when human beings are dehumanized by organizations in order to make it easier to kill them or move them or hurt them.
Yeah. So sticking with the abortion example, right? If you bring the time element into it and keep the moral element to it, then you can't just look at the moment of ending the life. You have to extrapolate beyond that. Well, if we have a moral obligation to stop this life from ending, then shouldn't we have a moral obligation to make sure that this life is, what have the philosophers said, free of pain, free of threat, these sorts of things?
Yes.
That we make no assurances after that. Once you're born, this is America where you make yourself and you have to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, which was an ironic statement to begin with. Just point that out. That was never meant to be.
Thank you for that.
It's never meant to be a statement that.
No, it was not. And you're spot on right about this, because this is what leads people to a different level of feeling and belief and everything else, because the complication is, what do you have the right to do, and what gives you that right? And then we're back to politics, and we're back to the relationship of the individual and the state, all because of qualia.
Yeah. So, yeah, this conversation is so complex, and we're not even going to come close to having answers here. So I might as well just introduce more questions.
Go.
We'd be remiss in this conversation if we didn't bring up artificial intelligence, right?
Yes.
And so I thought was very fascinating in doing research for the show. Is there is artificial? I think the way it was put was the artificial intelligence community, pretty much as a whole, outright rejects the idea that a computer system could ever be sentient.
Yes.
And that largely rests on the argument that we mentioned earlier, which states that sentience must come from a central nervous system, a neural network. Neural network, though, is the way that they describe how an AI system develops. So, do you think that AI researchers are falling into the same language trap, the same self-protective mental trap that an animal farmer does, right? In the way that they describe, butchering a cow or a pig or a sheep or a chicken, right? This idea of, do you think it's a self-protective thing, or do we trust that the argument that sentience can only be established through an organic central nervous system neural network? Do we accept that that's a good argument?
I can't accept that that's a good argument, precisely because what you just described, it becomes a self-referential anthropomorphic paradigm. If it's a neural network, well, whether you take neural network and you put them together, you have made something or are working on making something. And because it's coy to say, well, we're not working on trying to make a mind. Of course, we're working on trying to make, that's why it's artificial intelligence, but the artificial, it suggests artifice, which suggests made. And yet some of the very same people who are scientists and who are also Christians argue that we're created. Well, now we're creating something. All right, so it's made. It's constructed. It is artifice. Anything that has been made is artifice. Whether you concentrate on the word art or not. And so for us to say, again, I'll reference my friend, after millions of years of evolution, if we've come to the place now where, wow, look at our accomplishment. We're breaking the planet. We can't feed enough people across the planet. We are cruel and unjust within our own country, not let alone the rest of the planet. And we can create an intelligence, and we think we can create an intelligence that is more objective. Is that the goal? I've not seen that. I've not read that for artificial intelligence. We're creating an intelligence that we would recognize and therefore is like ours and therefore is going to have our flaws.
Yeah, the way that most of these artificial intelligence are created is by feeding them massive volumes of human created works, whether that is painting or music or literature, right, or, that's the way that they learn. And so, this idea, and
we don't have this, the singularity hasn't, that we know of, happened yet. We don't have the kind of artificial intelligence of a Commander Data in Star Trek or pick your science fiction. But we're aiming to that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, at the same time that we seem to be still caught in the idea that everything must serve us. So in essence, we create things to make them serve us, which is a very ugly and disturbing track record.
Yeah.
So I think that if a machine says that it feels, if we get to the point that there was one of the things I think you and I both read, but I was reading it a few days ago. If a person is working with artificial intelligence design and is sitting across from a created figure, and the figure frowns, if the android figure frowns and says, I'm not sure that I want to continue doing this experiment. It troubles me. Do we say, well, because of all the things that have been input into that, it's found the response that it wants to give to us? How is that different than us? Because of all the different all the things we reach out to prepare a podcast. We read, we dive in, we randomly find things and we share them. And because of what we've read and because of what we've experienced, then we give input, output. We respond and we adjust. That's what we're talking about artificial intelligence doing.
Right. And so I think that the linchpin of the argument that I think that most of the AI researchers reject is, again, the same thing with the mushroom, right? Is this, where do you separate the line between feeling and between sensation, right?
Yes.
I think that it's undeniable, right, that even the most basic computer systems might have sensation, right? You have cameras on things, right? I have a security camera, right, on my house. It's sensing light. What's it doing with that? Not much, it's
Right.
that's it's a review, but that's sensation. But
would it send out a
feeling,
distress signal if you broke the lens?
it would let me know, yeah. So
I mean, Thomas Nagel would be saying this is crap.
yeah, exactly.
Because he Nagel said there is nothing it is like for a thing to be a thing. It is an inanimate object. But artificial consciousness isn't an object. It might be enclosed within an object, and then we're back to mind-body dualism again.
Right, yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And that's the thing is, obviously, there's things about AI that you and I don't know. I've talked to actual AI researchers and stuff, and they've laid out how it works and how things go. But that's the thing, right? Is there is this. I don't think it's hubris, right? I don't think that it's this willing downplaying of the technology, but I do think it's kind of a blind spot or a bias, right? To say, oh well, we can unplug it at any time and it stops. Well, you could unplug us at any time and we would stop. Just like you said, right? The process of how it's doing things, right? And you get to language, and obviously there was that big thing earlier about the Google worker talking to Lambda. And it would do the very things that you were talking about. It would express its fears, right, to this guy. And well, is it just finding inputs, searching throughout its whole information, everything that it knows, and searching for fears and what people have said and picking the best options, or maybe the ones that are most applicable to the conversation that it was having with the researcher? Yeah, there's probably a good chance that's what it's doing. But how is that different from what we're doing, right? And I think it's that feeling and sensation, right? Does the computer feel fear, or does it just sense what people have said about fear and then turn it around? And I think that
what's the difference?
Right, and what's the difference? Yeah, it's an important question.
But what if a child says to us, "I'm really afraid," and the standard adult response, I think we try not to default to the standard, but often the standard is, "Oh, you don't have to be afraid. This is perfectly fine." Or somebody says to a kid who's going to get a shot, "Oh, this isn't going to hurt." Baloney, it does. Some will be honest and say it's going to feel like a pinch. Well, that's closer, but does a shot feel like a pinch? Maybe to some people it does. Does a shot feel like a prick? Does a shot feel like a break? Does a shot feel like a spear? Not to everybody.
Right.
How do we know if the machine, I'm not trying to be glib about this. I think we don't think about it necessarily enough.
And this comes back to the intro question. Are we asking, does the thing feel, or how do we know if the thing feels? And how do we answer that? Like, how do we justify that answer, saying, how do we know if the thing feels, or how do we know what it's like to be the thing?
Or we acknowledge that we sometimes go ahead and do things anyway, because after all, our space is our space. I could be held accountable for a horror of devastation earlier this week when a horde of stink bugs got inside one of the rooms in my house, and I went bloody Schwarzenegger on. I was appalled. I was get these things, get them out as fast as possible. And what you do is you kill them, or else you try to gather them up and throw them back outside. And sometimes you do some of both. Oh, was I better? Was I a more moral person because I put that stink bug out? But this one I just crushed. Yeah. We're complicit. We kill things.
Right. Yeah, and I had an interesting experience with that earlier in the week, right? If I see a spider around the house, normally I'm crushing it, right? But we had this tiny little spider that he made a little web on the bathroom sink, kind of near the toothbrushes. And every night I brush my teeth, I just look at him and he's just sitting there. And I just let him hang out. I'm not exactly sure why, but he stayed in that same spot for probably 2 weeks. And one day I noticed he was gone. And the first thing I did was check my toothbrush bristles. But then, later that day I was taking a shower and I see this tiny little spider crawling in the shower.
Yeah.
And I went to crush it. And then I went, I wonder if this is the same one that was by the sink. And I let him go, right? How anthropic is that? Right?
Well,
You're just this idea. And how does that change your perspective on things when you have this exposure over and over again? And again, you start to, you're anthropomorphizing. You're creating a story. And we've talked about stories and the power of stories, right? And you're ascribing characteristics to things. And that's another big part of this conversation, right? How much of, when we're talking about feeling and when we're talking about sensation, how much of it is things that these other objects are expressing to us? And how much of it is things that we are inventing or that we're looking into
about our own actions and looking into our own actions by creating that story? Yeah, I we do that.
Yeah,
that's true.
So again, we didn't get near any answers, but when I think, when we're talking about AI, at least for me, I'm not attempting to swing people one way or the other. Like I'm just as confused as everybody else is. And I'm just trying to look at all the sides of the different arguments. Same thing with the spider, right? Is it right to crush the spider or is it right to let him go? I don't know, but I do know that tiny jumping spiders have REM sleep. They just discovered that. So these little spiders dream, right? So they have sensations. They probably have feeling. They know in their little dreams, they know what it feels like to jump on prey. They can tell by the way that they move their legs and their mandibles and things. So again, what conclusions do we draw from this? It's very difficult. It's something we wrestle with. And we talked about it before the show. We said, this is going to be one of the most difficult topics that we've looked at, because when we talk about consciousness, it becomes easier to draw some of these distinctions. But sentience is much more basic. And like I said in the intro, or maybe shortly after the intro, the more basic or the more foundational something is, and the more critically you look at that thing, the more you have to start asking yourself, well, how do I know that this thing means what I think it means? Which is a language problem. It's an epistemology problem. It's an ontological problem.
And androids dream of electric sheep.
Right.
Philip K. Dick. That's marvelous. I was just thinking of that with you. We even have trouble describing what our own dreams are.
Yeah. So, man, this was fun, and I'm sure we'll explore other topics like it in the future. But until next time, keep on.